Thank you very much for coming to this session this afternoon. We are going to focus our attention on the front end of the criminal justice system. And we have with us today three excellent advocates and change agents and folks who are working on the ground on some really important issues related to pretrial justice. So I'm going to, my name is Faye Taxman. I am a professor at George Mason University. For those of you who aren't in this area, it's across the river. And my area of expertise is criminology and sentencing reform and corrections. Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Chris Burbank. I am the retired police chief in Salt Lake City. I spent 9 years as the police chief there. I was the vice president of the Major City Chiefs Association for 7 of those years. And then I have been currently involved and was involved with the Center for Policing Equity, which is a nonprofit research group that looks at the front end of this system, what's going on in policing and what is motivating the bias in the outcome, and how can we change that.
Thank you. Zach, you want to introduce?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Zachary Katznelson. Well, I suppose it may be somewhat unexpected to have a voice of reform from Salt Lake City. As it's wonderful. I love it. As a Jewish lawyer from New York, maybe slightly less surprising. But I work right now at a place called the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, which was founded by the Council, New York City Council Speaker a few years back to study jails in New York City and New York's criminal justice system and think about ways that we can reform it. It's actually not pushing to close down Rikers Island, which is the main jail complex in New York City, which is a brutally violent mess. My career, I've been a lawyer for almost 20 years, working in the criminal sphere, working in down south with the Equal Justice Initiative, representing people in Guantanamo Bay, kind of a range of things, death penalty work, juvenile justice work, and now in New York, where I'm from. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Hi everybody, good evening, good afternoon. You can tell which time zone I'm on. So I'm Insha Rahman and I'm the Director of Strategy and New Initiatives at the Vera Institute of Justice. And we are a national criminal justice organization that does research and policy change on all aspects of the criminal justice system, from the front end to the back end. And like Zachary, I come at this from being a long-time lawyer. I was a public defender up in the Bronx for many years before coming to Vera. And more recently in this role, I have taken myself out of just New York and work nationally, so it's great to get to be at a national conference. I know many of you hail from all parts of the country. And just on a personal note, it's especially sort of fun for me to get to talk to a group of folks who are coming here because of their faith and animating their social justice values. I grew up in a very religious Muslim family where our faith was very much what brought me to this work of seeing justice and fairness and equity as a fundamental part of my religious upbringing too. So really happy to be here today.
All right, so thank you. As you can see, we have an esteemed panel to highlight some issues about pretrial justice and pretrial reform. I just want to make sure that people understand kind of the context here. So the criminal justice system has many different parts to it. One part of it is pretrial, things that occur before someone gets sentenced by the court, and the second part, or third part, has to do with actually the series of activities that occur after a sentence, what happens to someone, whether they go to prison or jail, or on probation or parole, where the majority of people are. And the turn of attention to pretrial, I think, has been a major effort in the last several years from the justice reform perspective, mainly because the recognition, and this comes from an old, scholarly book that many of you might be interested in reading called The Process is the Punishment. And Malcolm Freely, who is a great, ethnographer, documented criminal court processes in Connecticut almost 30 years ago, in which he really showed how we do the pretrial process really is the punishment that a lot of people experience, and decisions that people make about whether they plead guilty have to do oftentimes more with trying to get this out of their lives than actually acknowledging that they actually did some harm or did a wrong. So we have 11 million people who pass through the justice system any year. From a pretrial perspective, there's about 8 million that are involved on a daily perspective. 95% of those people will plead guilty for those who actually get to that point in the system. And oftentimes those pleas may have nothing to do with the behaviors that actually brought them to the attention of the justice system. So we have a bit of a crisis. And one thing we know as a scholar, one thing we always talk about is what happens at the front end really affects the person's sentence. So if you were detained pre-trial, you were more likely to go to prison or be incarcerated post-adjudication. So it's really important, this part of the system, and it's very exciting for me to see so much attention to pretrial activities. So I'm going to, basically, each of my panelists are going to talk about some of their work for 5 minutes, or 5 to 7 minutes. Then we have a couple questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience to discuss the work you're doing or questions that you might have. So Chris, you want to talk about some of the work that the Center for Police Equity is doing?
Absolutely, thank you very much. So 11 million people going through pretrial. To put some perspective on this, when you look at law enforcement, so in Salt Lake City, every year we generated about 1 million contacts. Right? So 700 police officers and employees are contacting 1 million people traveling through Salt Lake City or living in Salt Lake City. Of those, it generated roughly 400,000 police reports of some type. And those contacts are anywhere from, hi, how are you today, where's the temple at, to possibly deadly force. And then when we look at the outcome of the criminal justice system, not just in Salt Lake City, but across the country, we see disparity that exists in who goes to prison. And there's tremendous studies done at great length that demonstrate that race, religion, gender are not indicators of criminal activity. But yet the expectation, and I want that word to kind of hang out there for a little bit, and I'll bring it back again. The expectation that law enforcement in this country believes that the community expectation of them is that you go out and you encounter these people based on where they might be, what they're potentially doing, right, in order to prevent crime. Because the goal of law enforcement, if we're just out there to document it after the fact, we're not doing a very good job. In fact, so we want to prevent it. And so in order to prevent it, if we know that somebody looks like, acts like this, and we intercede in their lives before they ever get a chance to engage in criminal activity, we're solving the problem. So you look historically and you say mid-90s, crime was at an all-time high. Police officers on the street, all-time high. The number of arrests and incarcerations were through the roof, but we weren't solving the underlying issue that we have. And so what we look at the Center for Policing Equity is, all right, what is driving the disparity in the outcome? Right? Is it valid police procedure? And we have for years, in fact for a lot of years, so it's been about 30 years since Rodney King, you can know better off the top of your head. When I entered policing, I don't know that we've changed any. And that is the largest frustration in my life, in my career, is that we're repeating the same behavior. And during that time, we've done a lot to educate police officers, right? We've trained them. It's taken on diversity training. It's called implicit bias training. It's sensitivity. Countless courses that we've given and focused on officer behavior. And what we've done is we've made the mistake that believing this problem is a hearts and minds issue, right? That it belongs to the bad police officers, and if only they viewed people differently, it would solve the problem. So part of what we do is when we look at police actions and what's going on in any given city, we give the officers, in essence, a behavioral test. to identify what are their personal feelings, right? What are they thinking about their job? What are they thinking about people that they're arresting, interacting with? What are they thinking about race, religion, and gender? And what you find driving the disparity in the outcome is not the personal feelings of the police officers. It is much more the parameters in which we send the officers out to work, the policy, the practice, procedures of any given agency. And this takes on the form of stop and frisk in New York City. Successful about 1% of the time. You look at search and seizure across the nation. Search and seizure for people who are asked for consent. Can I search you tonight? If those are individuals of color, a black male, you're about 8 times more likely to be asked to be searched in this country. The success of that is significantly lower, in fact, sometimes as low as 3% in some cities, compared to 24, 25% of the time when that same question is asked of a white male. Now, does that mean that if we just stopped a whole bunch of white guys on the street, we'd solve our crime problem? And just as foolish as going the other direction, right? They're absolutely not. But the efficacy of the effort that we put forth and the cost to society is significant. Justice is not equal across the board. So when my son, who at the time was 19 years old, got a couple speeding tickets, his father, the police chief, shows up. Judge looks at him and says, "Don't do that anymore, son. Be on your way. Pay the ticket." Over and done with. If you are in a different economic circumstance, if you don't happen to be the police chief's son, and you find yourself in the same situation in which you can't afford to pay the ticket, potentially your car was impounded, which in the city of Salt Lake is about $1,000 to get your car out of impound, minimum. I can't imagine what it is in New York City, right, just to go through the process. And if you're working trying to make a living, the impact of that is significant. This takes on the form, if you happen to be Muslim descent or belief, you are now in a database somewhere that your name is recorded for that exact same traffic stop. And so what we find is that the outcome of the system is nowhere near equal. And so you have to start to ask yourself, are we causing the crime problems that exist in any given neighborhood by the police action? Perfect example is narcotics. You don't have a narcotics problem in the city if you don't do narcotics enforcement, because nobody knows about it, right? But when you go out and you do narcotics enforcement, at what level are we doing that? We see a very interesting study taking place across the nation. We'll point to Colorado, right? When they legalized marijuana, the outcry from police was, oh, you legalize marijuana, crime is going to go through the roof. There's going to be all kinds of problems, issues, and everything else. Well, what we've actually seen is crime's gone down in Colorado. Use of force is dropping in Colorado. And interestingly enough, I was just there a few months ago and questioning some of their statistics and what's going on. The dispensaries in Colorado are having a hard time staying in business. Competition is to the point, and what happened is you saw a huge increase. Many people from the state of Utah driving over to Colorado to purchase marijuana. That spiked and now is leveling off. And we're not seeing the negative outcomes from that action. Have we not improved the safety of citizens who live in Colorado by not doing marijuana enforcement? And I know that sounds a little radical. But
a good question.
It's
right?
a very good question, but it's one to be asked, right? How do we measure the well-being of a neighborhood? If there's less police interaction needed, if fewer violent crimes occur, isn't the perception that safety is higher? Minnesota has a very interesting study going on. So recently, Minneapolis decided not to enforce vehicle equipment violations, right? Which, in fact, in Minneapolis resulted in the death of an individual for a for a brake light being out. Instead, they hand you a voucher to go get your car fixed. When you look, right, and think about this in your neighborhood, what is the busy street that the cops always hang on and write lots of tickets? Right? You know what it is, and they're always there. Imagine how much we've spent to do enforcement there. Imagine the cost to society being paid out in tickets. Do people still speed on that roadway? Have we changed behavior whatsoever? But things like speed boards, even just having a police car parked on the street not doing anything, changes behavior. So with that, I got a nasty note here that said I'm out of time. No. I will yield.
But we have to keep the
No,
Zachary and Insha
thank
time,
you.
so thank you. I'll be passing this along, Zachary. Thank you, thanks.
So thanks. So I want to talk a little bit about the next step in the process after police take action, which is bail and pretrial incarceration. And it really, as Chris was saying, the impact that the system we have now has on people is vastly disproportionate. Vastly disproportionate in terms of people's race and vastly disproportionate in terms of people's wealth. And so if somebody is arrested, and they're charged with a crime, they will be taken before a judge. And in almost every state in this country, the judge will make a decision about whether or not to impose money bail on the person. Washington, D.C. is one of the few places that doesn't have that, but most places in the country do. And so the judge will basically say, if you want to be free pending your trial, you need to pay X amount of money. And oftentimes it's not a lot of money, $500, $1,000, $2,000. That I think for probably most people in this room, you'd be able to afford or scrape together pretty quickly. But for many folks, $300 might as well be $3 million. And there is no chance that they'll be able to afford it. And so just to give you a couple examples, you have a contrast of how this works. And so the issue is not ultimately really about safety, because if you have money, you can be free, no matter what you're charged with. An example is Harvey Weinstein. Harvey Weinstein is accused of rape and sexual assault. He was asked to pay $1 million in bail. He paid it on the spot. He walked out of the courtroom. He spent not an hour in jail. Now, I'm not talking about guilt or innocence here. I'm just talking about the seriousness of the charges. You have somebody like Khalif Browder, who many of you may have heard of. There's a child in New York City, 16 years old, who was accused of stealing a backpack, accused of robbery. His bail was set at $3,000, which his family could not afford. He claimed absolutely positively he was innocent, and he refused to plead guilty to the crime. He spent 3 years in jail in New York City in Rikers Island, waiting for a trial that never came. At the end of those 3 years, the prosecutor dismissed the case, and he walked out the door. And because of the trauma that he experienced, the beatings, the abuse, he ended up taking his own life. And if you look at the racial impact here, Khalif Browder, black, Harvey Weinstein, white, but think about just wealth disparities. In this country, the median white family has 15 times the wealth of the median black family, 12 times the wealth of the median Latinx family. If for a quarter of black families in this country, if liquidated every single asset they had, every single asset, they would have $5 or less. So what does it mean if somebody is given bail and that, facing those circumstances of even a few hundred or a few $1,000s? And you are faced with this choice. Khalif Browder, for instance, the prosecutor kept coming to him and say, just plead guilty and you can go home. Just say you did it. And if he said, no, I did not, they said, well, you have that choice. You can stay here in jail. And in his case, it was 3 years. 2 years in solitary, by the way. Or plead guilty, go home, but you will have a permanent criminal record. And a permanent criminal record hobbles you for life in terms of getting jobs, in terms of a young person like him getting student loans, in terms of applying for housing. A landlord can do a criminal records check. You won't get that apartment. There are lots of ways that this impacts people. And it really changes the dynamic. It also, I just want to say something about violent crime particularly, because obviously that is deeply concerning to all of us. But across this country, the percent of people who are arrested for violent crime, who are actually found guilty of it, is much lower than you would think. Across the country, 40% of people, the case is dismissed entirely or they're acquitted of the crime. Right? In New York City, it's actually over 50% of the time. This is people accused of violent crime. And most of the time when people are convicted, they're not convicted of what they were initially charged with, but of a lesser crime. And so what we see and we hear is this very concerning fear about what happens about people who are violent who are going to be on the street if we don't have money bail, or if we don't have high enough bail for people to keep them in. And again, one, if you have money right now, you go free no matter what you're charged with. And two, a lot of times what you hear at the outset of a case is not what actually turns out to be what may have taken place, or certainly what the government can prove. And that matters a lot. Innocent until proven guilty is not just something we should aspire to. It means something very real. Half of those cases in New York City where the case goes away, disappears entirely when it was a violent crime that was charged in the first place. And so in New York, one of the things I do, besides my day job about this work, is that I'm actually head up the social justice team, racial justice team at my synagogue in Brooklyn. We're the largest Reformed synagogue in Brooklyn, borough of 3 million people, over 1,000 families in our shul. And we worked on bail reform over the last several years with other synagogues, with faith communities across our city, and indeed across our state, and partnered with people who were directly impacted, some in our congregations, some beyond, including Khalif Browder's brother, for instance, and worked to try and change the bail system in New York. And we succeeded. And so starting this January, starting just last month, New York has a new bail law, which eliminates money bail as an option for judges for most misdemeanors. There's an exception for domestic violence, primarily in some sex crimes, who are lower level sex crimes, and for most non-violent felonies. So if you're charged with virtually any violent felony, you're charged with actually seriously trying to hurt somebody, money bail remains an option. But for everything else, the judge has what is now an increased range of options than there were before. It was basically money or nothing, and some forms of lower level supervision. But now judges can impose more conditions of release, meaning that people have to get mental health treatment or drug treatment, that people can have to wear ankle monitors, for instance. And there are all these things here that give a judge a menu of options, but not cash bail. I'm not saying the amount of money in your wallet is going to determine whether you go free or not. And there has been, so this law's been in place now for just a few weeks. There has been tremendous pushback. And I think that is a mild statement from the law enforcement community in New York. And it is rippling across this country, that what is happening in New York is setting the tone for efforts across the country around bail. And there is a mix of, I believe that whenever you are going to undertake public policy, especially something so critical as this that involves public safety and involves people's lives on every level, that you should do it based on facts and data, and not just on hyperbole or on tabloid headlines. But that is unfortunately the kind of debate we're having right now in New York, is very much based on fear and manipulation of facts. And it doesn't mean there's not sometimes some truth in there. But I think to their great disservice, many in the law enforcement community, not all, but many, are mischaracterizing what has happened. And I'll give you an example: anti-Semitism. So in New York City, New York State, and indeed around the country, anti-Semitism has been rising. In the last 5 years, it has gone up pretty dramatically in New York City. But come January 1, there were incidents right around the turn of the year. There was, of course, a horrific attack in New Jersey, another one in Muncie, New York, where people died. And then you had incidents in Brooklyn where there was a woman named Tiffany Harris, for instance, who was accused of slapping 3 Orthodox women on the street and cursing them out because they were Jewish. And she then was released under, this is just before the new law kicked in, but she was released without bail. And that would have happened under the old law, frankly, and under this current law. Right? In Brooklyn, in cases like that, bail was not requested for a case like that in the past several years, just wasn't. So she was then, the next day, she hit somebody else, not Jewish, not anti-Semitic attack, but hit somebody else. She was arrested again. This time she was put under community supervision, and then a few days later she was put into an inpatient hospital unit. And actually one of the Orthodox women who was initially slapped has spoken up in the media, spoken up at rallies and said when Tiffany Harris did this to me, she was clearly unwell. I could see that she was not mentally stable. And I, this Jewish woman, the Orthodox woman, saying, I want her to get treatment. I don't want her incarcerated. Because incarceration is deeply destabilizing. Deeply destabilizing for somebody who has mental illness. For anybody, frankly, but especially someone with mental illness. And so, but she was then in a mental hospital. And as part of the politicization of this issue, just last week, William Barr, the Attorney General, came to New York and announced that his office was going to introduce hate crimes, charge Ms. Harris with hate crimes, and potentially make her eligible for over a decade of incarceration for this incident of slapping these 3 women. And the idea was basically to pull her out of the inpatient mental health care that she's receiving now and possibly lock her up in a federal institution, pre-trial. And so this is the kind of thing that is happening right now. It's being basically done in our name. And so there are many of us in the Jewish community who are pushing back and saying, listen, this is not right. First of all, it's not right how you're treating this individual case, but don't use anti-Semitism as a reason to roll back bail reform when the two are not connected. You could roll back this bail reform right now, and we would still have 5 years of rising hate and violence in our community directed against us. This will not solve the problem. In fact, it may well make it worse because it will drive a wedge with people from other communities that are being oppressed and drive us a wedge because we are now imposing more on them in the name of protecting us falsely. Thank you.
Thank you.
All of that.
I'll pass it down again.
You can be the deliverer of bad news.
Yes. Sorry, Insha.
So, in all of this, I want to say that we're actually at a moment of tremendous opportunity for criminal justice reform. So these reforms that got passed last year in New York to bail that just came into effect have, despite the fear-mongering, had tremendous success in terms of making sure that people aren't held in jail in New York because they can't afford bail. Literally, we've seen the overall jail population in New York decline from this time last year to now by 30%. That's tremendous for ending mass incarceration. What we've seen in places like New Jersey that also did bail reform back in 2017 is they've also experienced a significant decline in their jail population, and arrests are actually way down and public safety is up. And we have examples of this again and again and again across the country. And this has really sort of taken hold in the last 5 years. And it's been tremendous. And it's been because communities from across, sort of the country have come together to care about these issues and to work on them. But we're also at a moment where, being sort of at this place of opportunity, there's also the real fear of rollbacks and backlash. How many of you remember and know the name Willie Horton? Raise your hand. Pretty much everybody here, because it was the case in 1988 that derailed Michael Dukakis's, presidential bid. And what we've learned in this moment that we're currently in is that the specter of Willie Horton looms large still. And why is that? It's because to some degree, the statistics and the reasoning really doesn't resonate with folks the way the sort of media headlines and that visceral fear of being harmed, that visceral fear of crime is just, it's the thing that trumps any kind of data or reason or sense in this field. And so my organization, Vera, we work nationally. We've been around for almost 60 years. And we work on everything from policing to bail, which happens to be my area of work, to actually changing the conditions of confinement in jails and prisons, to parole and all sorts of other issues. And what we have seen, and the common thread is, if you actually don't change the narrative, if you don't change people's visceral reactions to what happens when we actually take concrete steps to end mass incarceration, we're really vulnerable and we're really susceptible. And here's a specific example, Alaska, which is about as purple a state as it gets, and we sort of forget about it because it's hanging out up there, by Canada. But Alaska actually passed some really important pretrial reforms back in 2016. And the minute that they went into effect, there was immediately backlash. Every single, sort of incident that might have happened, even if these new laws hadn't gone into effect, were put on the front page of the news. And even though the statistics didn't actually show a real crime spike, there was enough fear in the legislature that literally within a couple of months, they rolled back most of the most the more effective parts of Alaska's pretrial reform. And where are they today? Basically, they haven't moved an inch. The number of people who are getting arrested, who are in jail, and who are in prison there. And I use that example to say, hey, we have to really think about what sort of narrative change, how do we push back against that sort of visceral fear about criminal justice reform and about, you know, this sort of myth that people still believe that you can't possibly have fewer people in jail without compromising public safety. We know from the numbers that's frankly not true, but I think most people in this country still carry around that myth and they believe it to be true. And so one of the things we have really focused on in the past couple of years is doing the work around examples of how can we do things differently. And this country is actually, we are sort of outsized and unique in how we do criminal justice. We've heard some of the statistics of 11 million people coming into contact with the criminal justice system each year. That's about 10.4 million arrests each year. It's 2.2 million people in jail and prison right now in this country. About 500,000 of those are people who are held in pre-trial on bail that they can't afford. There's another 4.5 million people under what's known as community supervision, so on probation or parole. Those are staggering, staggering statistics. And we are actually unique in how much we use the criminal justice system and certainly incarceration and supervision in the name of public safety. And so we've actually gone and taken corrections officials, law enforcement officials, influencers to other parts of the world to say, how do they do this, right? And for example, in Germany, only 5% of anybody who gets arrested actually ever sees the inside of a jail or a prison cell. That's simply not true here. There's upwards of probably, I don't know what the estimates are, other smart folks here certainly know them. But yeah, it's much, much higher. What we also know is the conditions in which we incarcerate people here. Many of us have been following the news about what's happening in Parchman Prison in Mississippi, right? And the number of deaths that have happened in just a short period of time. That would be unthinkable in a place like Germany or Norway, where they believe that if we're going to take away your freedom, that is the only thing you lose. You don't lose your dignity, you don't lose your sense of humanity, and you certainly don't lose your safety, right? And so these are examples of what can we be doing differently, from how police officers interact with people on the street, so that for many, many members of our communities, the first reaction when you see a police officer isn't to say, uh-oh, I am worried, or I want to cross the street, or I want to figure out how to get out of this interaction as quickly as possible. Can we create a new paradigm for what law enforcement does, so we actually truly across all segments of our communities believe that law enforcement is there for protection and for help, not to terrorize or not to cause and inspire fear. When we go in front of judges and prosecutors, how do we actually create a system where their power is wielded in ways to make sure that we keep people out of the system and that we address the underlying issues that brought them there in the first place, which might be things like mental health needs or substance use needs or instability because of housing or homelessness or poverty. And sometimes the reasons why people are in the system is actually because of law enforcement and prosecutorial overreach. How do we have a system where that isn't the case? And then if we do have to rely on incarceration to make sure that we're delivering on public safety, how do we make sure, again, that the only thing that we are taking away from people is their liberty and not everything else? And there are actually great examples of this. Even in this country, we're starting to see examples. In Connecticut, we're working with a prison where truly there have been no incidents of violence for the past 2 years. 60 Minutes featured it a couple of months ago to say, this is how we can do incarceration. We've seen places like New Jersey and New York change money bail so that money is no longer the determinant of whether you get out. And again, examples like Colorado, where we've seen law enforcement really change what they do as well. And so I offer that to say there is absolutely hope, but we have to do so much more given how outsized our system is and the need for change.
Thank you. As you can see, each of our panelists has a lot more to say than the 5 or 7 minutes that we've allocated. And I think at least one message I heard quite a bit from our panelists was the importance of really understanding the reforms and why these reforms are necessary, but also then thinking about, you know, why it's important to keep moving in the reform direction instead of backtracking to how we've been doing business over the last, 40 years or so. One statistic I want to put out there, because it always is eye-opening, is that 20% of the American population, adults, has a criminal record now. So it's no longer just somebody we don't really know, where it's an othering sort of issue. It's actually our neighbors and students and, friends and colleagues.
And me.
All right.
There's one in every crowd.
Yeah, so, it's normalized in many ways, but it's very harmful for the experiences that people have. So I think I'm going to ask each of our panelists to answer this one question, and then I want to open it up for you to ask questions or to share some of your own thoughts on how to empower your communities to really work on these reforms. So I guess I'm just going to quickly say, if you could just jot down or identify, what do you think is the most important reform that we need to be really subscribing to today or thinking about?
I get to go first.
Sure.
So I would go back to expectation that we have of police officers, right? The notion that if somebody, for whatever reason, makes me feel uncomfortable, I call the police and they need to come take care of it immediately, has got to change. Because that leaves us in a situation where all police officers are doing is solving the problem for tonight. And unfortunately, jail is the easiest answer to that. Take them off the street.
Okay, thank you. Zach.
Throw something slightly different out than I spoke about. In addition to the critical importance of bail is on the back end, and people who, for instance, who are on parole, who've done time in prison, who've completed their sentence, are now under community supervision. As Insha mentioned, 4.5 million or so people around the country on probation or parole right now under some type of community supervision. Many times they can be reincarcerated for the smallest of things. Curfew violation, 15 minutes late for your curfew, automatic incarceration. Smoking marijuana, automatic incarceration. Missing an appointment with your parole officer, automatic incarceration. And it is something that is deeply destabilizing for people that already have enough challenges trying to reestablish their lives coming out of prison in terms of getting a job, in terms of getting housing. And our parole systems are very often built right now not to help people get reestablished and reintegrated into society, but instead to watch them like a hawk and too frequently send them right back to prison.
It's so hard to only pick one, but here's my one that I actually think matters to every single person in this country, which is to pay attention to criminal justice reform beyond the big cities. We've seen in places like New York City and Chicago and Philadelphia, we've seen jail populations decline by 27%. But yet in rural and small town America, in that same period of time, incarceration is going way, way up and continues to be this quiet jail boom. And so until we start paying attention to each and every place in this country, we're actually not going to end mass incarceration. It's the same tools in terms of reforms, but it's actually pushing in different parts of the country beyond the places where we've seen good momentum. We need to go further.
Well, I think you've got some good ideas here, so I'm going to open it out for the crowd. Sir, I
Bob
can't see.
Lincoln
Okay.
from Pennsylvania. I agree with everything that you're saying, but there's one thing that you're not saying, and this is not saying, you know what I'm talking about, your resolution on criminal justice for the Jewish Council on Public Affairs, not saying. Somebody needs to say, we simply have too many people incarcerated, and therefore we need, as religion, as a community, as a Jewish Council on Public Affairs, to advocate for a substantial reduction in the number of people incarcerated. See, once you start there, then all the other things will fall into place. And of course, if you wanted to do only one thing, it would be cash bail, because 15% of the incarcerated people as we're sitting here today are incarcerated and haven't been convicted of crime. So you'll do the most, that one thing will do the most immediately. And I don't understand why all the organizations in Pennsylvania, we have an organization against life in prison without parole. We have an organization on drugs. We have, everybody has a little piece of it, okay? But no one's saying, hey, as a society, we shouldn't be spending $81 billion on incarcerating people. And in Pennsylvania, it's something over $5 billion. And once we make it as a society, the determination that we have too many people in prison, they say, well, what should it be? Well, I don't want to copy Denmark. I don't want to copy Canada. You know what I want to copy? I want to copy the United States in 1970. Take that number, what percentage? We had about 100 people incarcerated for 100,000 people. Now we have 650 or something like that. That would be a perfectly good goal, but I don't want to quibble about how much we should reduce it. But we need to have a resolution of the Jewish Council on Public Affairs that says we have too many people. You talk about criminal justice reform. Nobody wants to come out and say, end mass incarceration. We're not saying that either.
So Bob, I would recommend tomorrow, there's a network meeting at 4:30 in the afternoon, and I would recommend that you come to that network meeting. It's an opportunity to get a discussion going there about adding to resolutions.
Evie.
Evie, and then Bruce, I'll have you.
So in the course of the conversation, I think there's two subject matters that have to be added to every conversation, which is whether you enter the justice involved, whether your justice involved pretrial or whether it's through conditions of confinement or reentry, the trauma that you face just by walking in that door and the trauma you face from the sexual violence, which nobody talks about, but the level of sexual violence in all prisons is off the charts, and there is no Me Too movement behind the bars. And so I came out of prison damaged. I'll never be the same person I was, and I'll never have the serenity I had. So in this equation, when we talk about the numbers, we must deal with the trauma. And the second piece is the economics. The most important element, why it's being pushed back is if you release 21,000 people in New York, 10,000 correction officers lose their job. This doesn't take a rocket science. And the amount of money you get from bail reform, the judicial system would have to live without and fire staff. So let's be real. This is an economic issue, and we need to talk about trauma. And I want to add one piece, which is as slavery evolved into mass incarceration, what we are also not talking about is there are double the number of people under mass supervision than there were under mass incarceration. And as we are releasing people, they're not going home, they're going on ankle bracelets where they're legally, technologically being surveilled. And to me, if we don't look at the legal surveillance of the millions of people that we know about, then we are not looking at the next evolution or the next Jim Crow that we're facing.
Thank you for those comments. I think you have a lot of insights into some of the things that we don't like to talk about with incarceration. Our panel today is to really try and help focus attention on why we should be really focused on pretrial, which is stopping the floodgates for incarceration. But some good insights, Bruce.
I'm going to do something that a lawyer's not supposed to do, so I'm going to ask a question I don't know the answer to.
Oh my God.
But we do have a resolution for those in the room tomorrow on marijuana legalization to put JCP on record on that. Chief Burbank, you talked about the experience in Colorado. Is that something that is replicated across the other states that have adopted marijuana legalization?
So I don't necessarily have good statistical data that says, yes, absolutely that is. But that is the trend I believe we are seeing take place. And so I was always, as a police officer, of the mindset that we should decriminalize, but not necessarily legalize. Because I didn't believe that the states had the infrastructure to deal with it. And we still don't with banks. I mean, there's some problems associated with it that need to be resolved. But the the dramatic change in what I see as use of force and incarceration for low-level possession charges has moved me to the direction that I think this is the right way to go and would actually reduce. When you consider, I mean, there are people incarcerated now for possession of marijuana that are doing longer sentences than some very horrible criminals. And we're not seeing any reform, we're not seeing, nothing is, you know, the behavioral change, as you spoke of, right, doesn't occur. It makes them worse, and we're making these people for possession of this criminals for the long term.
Could I add something about ending money bail? So folks talk a lot about ending money bail will at least get us really far in terms of ending mass incarceration. But I want to urge you all, as you're thinking about ending money bail, which is exactly right, you want to take money out of the equation for pretrial release or pretrial detention, but you want to couple that with a couple of other things. And the first is to make sure that you end money bail and you are reducing the number of people in jail. And bear with me for a second, because this is actually a really important live debate right now in the bail reform field. California passed a new bail law in 2018 that the bail bond industry was incensed about because it eliminates money bail entirely, right? So their livelihood is gone. That's great. But the problem is the law that California passed actually allows for unfettered discretion for prosecutors to ask for and for judges to impose pretrial detention. Basically for anything, even if it's a low-level offense, judges can still actually detain you, and this time you don't have the safety valve of being able to pay $500 or $1,000. So you can sort of follow that to its logical conclusion. You can imagine how ending money bail doesn't actually lead to ending mass incarceration. So I really urge you all to say end money bail and make sure that you are decarcerating, reducing the number of people in jail, and that you're addressing racial disparities as you do it, because as Zachary said, the racial disparities of our pretrial system especially falls hard on black and brown people and black and brown communities. And then the other part is for who we are taking away their liberty to have individualized due process. As a public defender in the Bronx, I stood by many people during their bail hearings. I argued thousands of times over bail. And then coming into my role at Vera, where I've traveled the country and watched bail hearings across this country, more often than not, people are losing their liberty, they're having bail set without a lawyer next to them, without any opportunity to argue for their liberty. And so you've got to make sure that we're doing due process right by making sure that there's access to counsel and that there's actually a full hearing before we take away somebody's liberty, whether that's because we set bail or impose what's called preventative detention or remand if we're not using a money bail system. So I put all of that out there to complicate it a little bit and to give you some insight on where the challenge is.
Now, New Jersey, the Chief Justice of New Jersey Supreme Court came to the Jewish Council of Public Affairs a couple of years ago, and he said that 13% were being remanded and 87% were being released on their own recognizance. What would you suggest as a judge should do if someone machine gunned 6 people down on the sidewalk? Are you really going to let him out until his trial?
So the way that it should work is it should be based on the level of offense. So that offense, no, I think everybody in this room could agree that's somebody who poses a real threat to somebody else's physical safety. That's a person who's going to be detained pre-trial. But across the country, actually only 5% of all arrests in the country are for crimes of what we think of as violence. The vast majority of arrests, including in a place like New Jersey, are things for low-level drug possession, for petty theft, for offenses that involve things like driving with a suspended license or having other sort of traffic-related offenses. They are low level. And so it's not just saying sort of categorically everybody is released or everybody is detained, but to actually have an important conversation about which offenses are we concerned about public safety, and for those to have the due process hearing, and for everything else to say, we're going to release you. We might need to think about some pretrial services and supports to make sure that you come back to court and to make sure that we're giving you an opportunity to address whatever issues are leading you into the system in the first place. But that's the right approach to it. It's not to just say blanket everybody out or everybody in.
Yes.
Thank you.
So,
Sorry, I can't see names.
Abby Shrosky. So I come to this with connection within NYPD, formerly connection within NYPD. So when I saw yesterday that an officer was shot in the Bronx, and then again this morning an officer was shot in the 4-1 precinct, I'm wondering, how do we respond to first law enforcement who are now wondering, how do we make the changes that, yes, on a very deep level we know need to be changed, but then this happens, and officers are shot in what's being called assassination attempts. And then the second part, how do we bring this to our communities who are trying to balance out these two things as well? So first, how do we encourage law enforcement, and then how do we make it a real issue in our communities?
Mind if I jump in on that one first?
Yeah, go for it.
So losing a police officer is a horrible thing to have happen. But the fact of the matter, in communities that you look at that are making changes to policing, right, there are fewer uses of force. So force has declined in some of these communities by about 20%, which is significant. Officer injury and death has declined by 13%. So it all goes down. And the most dangerous moment in time is that point where you have to physically interdict somebody. And that may just be taking them into custody or searching them. If you have fewer of those times occur, and you've developed a system whereby people trust that you are going to treat them legitimately and with dignity, they tend not to strike back or cause that situation. Imagine, if you will, right, the first time that you encounter a police officer, you don't know what's going on, I mean, it's all new. Now it's the 25th time that you've been stopped by the police and searched by the police, and you're a little fed up with it because the only reason that you're being stopped is because you're in this neighborhood and you happen to be the wrong skin color. At that moment when they say, I'm going to search you again, that's when some of these incidents occur. Right? What we are lacking, we are experiencing a crisis of trust. And if we all trust the system, not just the police officer themselves, but the entire system will treat people fairly, then the woman who is suffering from mental illness, we're going to call and say, yes, she's got some problems and issues, will you come deal with her fairly, before it ever arises to the point that she's slapping people on the street. But because we don't have that trust and confidence, who is going to call and say, hey, the neighbor kid down there, he's problematic, he's not doing anything wrong, but will you deal with him fairly? And I think that's the difference, and that's where we need to be, because otherwise we jump into the us against them mentality that one of us, one of them kind of thing. No, that's not the way the system works. It's inherently a dangerous job because of what we expect. But when we start to expect realistic, humane interactions and humane outcomes for people that the police encounter, then that changes the entire dynamic.
Yes, and how do we reset from when an incident like this happens? Because that's the pain that I feel. I agree with everything you're saying. I'm also wondering, how do we get everyone back on board when these things happen?
So I'm going to be extremely harsh on my peers, right? This is an administrative situation, right? This is the point where the person who is in charge steps up and says, yes, this is a tragic incident that we suffered, that one of our individuals lost their lives in this circumstance. But we are going to continue down this road and make the change, right? I will always advocate that when you look statistically at what goes on every single day in law enforcement, it's a pretty safe job to do. And we need to reset that and make sure that we're telling that story just as much as we're telling the dramatic stories. And that's how I think you kind of move beyond those incidents. You have to recognize them every bit as much as we have to recognize the injustice that's taken place, especially against black men in this nation.
Insha?
So I want to jump in because I've been following what's happening in New York City really closely, including Commissioner Shea and Mayor de Blasio blaming a recent uptick in crime on bail reform in New York. And one of the things that I think is most challenging about having the honest conversation, so how can we reset from that? Because what happened yesterday, in the Bronx is tragic. The police officer actually didn't die, but he was shot badly in the neck. And part of the challenge is everything feels so politicized and weaponized, in part because when criminal justice reform happens, I think law enforcement, except for exceptions like, you know, Chief Burbank and his peers, they tend to see it as an affront to them, that we are making these reforms essentially to say we don't value you. And so that's part of the work I think we all need to do, is to say we want to work with you on these reforms. We want you to be partners with us, which is often not how criminal justice reform happens, and that's just a fact. And it's because trust and relationships are so frayed. But it also undermines trust in very key ways when Commissioner Shea and Mayor de Blasio cherry pick statistics to say, well, you know, crime is up 17% from January of 2019 to January of 2020, when we actually went and looked at the statistics. And if you look between January of 2015 to January of 2016, murders were up 42%. If you look from 2017 to 2018 in January, felony assaults were up 24%. But since there was no backdrop of criminal justice reform, of bail reform, those statistics weren't highlighted as anything that was like, look, there's the usual upticks and downticks if you go month to month, and none of that in and of itself is of concern. In fact, what the police commissioner at the time and the mayor said at the time is, look, New York City is continuously declining in terms of arrests, in terms of crime, and we should feel really proud of how safe our city is. But in this moment, they are cherry-picking statistics, in part because they feel affronted by these reforms, as if it's a threat to them. And that's fundamentally the narrative that we need to change. And I think that's what we need to do to reset and to make sure that after these awful, awful, tragic incidents happen, and they will happen, there is no sort of, you know, making sure that they never happen, but how can we be resilient enough to keep moving forward after? And part of it is making sure that when we pass reforms, we see law enforcement as our partners to move forward, and that law enforcement doesn't go to the cherry picking and to the sort of weaponizing the moment that we're in to push back against reform.
Just say one thing about engaging with our congregations or organizations. You know, one thing we did was that we invited to our shul both police officers and people who've been directly impacted to come and speak with our congregants, but with each other as well. And I think it's very rare for those two groups of folks, and there is occasionally some overlap, but to actually speak to each other and to understand the ramifications of behavior on both sides, and decisions on both sides. What it ultimately meant for us, though, was that we came out even more strongly in favor of reform. And I think a lot of the officers understood a bit better some of the communities that they were policing, and some of the folks in the communities understood a bit more about the officers were coming from. Proximity matters tremendously, and we won't get anywhere in terms of reform if we don't actually start talking to each other. And I would just say one of the reasons that ultimately came down for us was that, you know, motivated obviously by our Jewish values and the passages of the Torah that we know so well, things like justice, justice shall you pursue. But justice, justice shall you pursue. The next piece of that is that so you shall live. Right? This is critical for all of us. If we really want public safety, we need these reforms. For the police, for us, these are not just some pie in the sky desires. These are things that actually genuinely work to make us all safer. And if we start to pursue them together, that's when we have real hope for change.
So I get to, as moderator, I get to be the bearer of bad news that this interesting discussion must end.
Oh.
But we do have another session at 3 o'clock for those of you who would like to continue the discussion. So I want to thank the panelists for basically giving And I'd like to give a charge to all of you to really think about in your own communities what type of reforms are happening at the front end of the system, and thinking about, as Zach has said, how to get those dialogues going in your shuls, in your communities, in order for us to really have some long-term success here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.